The alarms hit first. Not a slow escalation, not the measured chime of a routine monitor drop. This was the shriek of three machines colliding into a single flatline scream at 2001 Ford in the morning. A sound that traveled down the trauma corridor of Mercy General like a pressure wave and turned every head that was still awake. Bay 7 had been sealed off since midnight. The patient inside was a John Doe on the intake sheet, listed that way because he'd been brought in without identification, without a wallet, without dog tags, with nothing but a field dressing wrapped around his left side that no civilian EMT had ever seen used outside of a forward operating base. The dressing was the military-grade hemostatic kind, packed tight with combat gauze, applied by someone who knew exactly what compression angle would buy enough time to reach a hospital. The paramedics who transferred him said he'd been found 40 minutes outside the city on a county road, unconscious in the back of a truck with plates that didn't match any registered vehicle in 3 states. Nobody said that out loud yet, but some of the staff had noticed the dressing, and some of them had noticed her. She'd been assigned to Bay 7 at midnight changeover, not by choice, not by seniority, just by the arithmetic of a short-staffed overnight shift. Her name on the board read Claire Hartley RN, and everything about her looked exactly like what the board suggested, a working floor nurse in her mid-30s. Fair skin carrying the particular flushed fatigue of a 12-hour shift that had already gone 14, blonde hair pulled into a low bun with a few strands loose near her temples, blue V-neck scrubs. White sneakers with a smudge of iodine solution across the left toe. She wore a silver wristwatch she never took off. She moved the way experienced nurses move when they're tired, economical, no wasted steps, every reach landing exactly where it needed to. Nobody had paid her much attention. Until the alarms. If you've ever wondered what it looks like when a single room stops being a room and becomes a controlled collapse, stay with this story. Because what happened in the next 11 minutes inside Bay 7 wasn't something the staff at Mercy General had a training module for. She was already at the bedside when the monitor hit flatline, not running, already there. Her left hand found the patient's wrist in the dark half-second before the overhead fluorescents kicked to their emergency brightness, and her fingers pressed with a precision that wasn't checking for a pulse so much as reading one, locating it through habit the way a pilot finds an instrument by touch without looking down. "Get me a crash cart and get me Dr. Vance," she said. Her voice didn't rise. That was the first thing the night shift aide, a 23-year-old named Madison who had been 3 steps behind her in the corridor, would remember afterward. The voice was level, not flat. Level, there's a difference. Flat is absence of feeling. Level is feeling controlled down to something useful. "He's in the surgeon's lounge. I'll page him now. Tell him the patient in 7 has an SVT cascade with a secondary pressure drop. Tell him exactly those words. Go." Madison went. Claire was already adjusting the IV line, running her thumb along the tubing with that same tactile certainty, checking for a kink she'd apparently suspected before the alarm told her to. She found it. A slight compression at the junction where the line had been taped to the rail, a small, easy thing to miss on a nighttime intake when everyone's moving fast and the lighting in the bay wasn't designed for fine work. She corrected it with one hand while her other reached for the defibrillator panel and began entering a charge sequence without looking. At this point, 3 more nurses had arrived at the bay door. 2 of them were more senior. One of them, Brenda Hollis, charge nurse of the overnight, with a decade on Claire at this hospital, pushed through immediately and began taking in the room. "Who authorized the cardiac protocol on this patient?" Brenda asked, not cruelly, but with the authority of someone accustomed to being the most senior clinical presence in an emergency. "He wasn't stable enough to transfer. The pressure cascade started at, I'm asking who authorized it, Claire." She didn't stop moving. "He'll destabilize before Vance gets here if I don't hold the rhythm. His history. We don't have a history. We have a John Doe." "I have a history," Claire said. And that was the moment. Not dramatic, not announced, just 7 words delivered while her hands continued their work, steady as machinery, and the line they drew through the room was invisible but absolute. Brenda Hollis paused. The pause was small. A second, maybe less. But it was real, and the aide who'd come back in the door caught it and remembered it. What happened next was medical in its details, but deeply human in its texture. Claire walked the room through a controlled intervention that should have required 2 physicians, an anesthesiologist on standby, and a crash cart team. She did not perform it alone, she directed it. That's the specific word. She moved the two available nurses into positions and gave them each a single precise instruction calibrated to their level of competence. And then she occupied the space at the patient's left side that no one else seemed to know how to fill. The patient's blood pressure had been dropping in a particular pattern since midnight, not uniformly in a step sequence with irregular spikes that didn't match a clean septic picture or a straightforward internal bleed. The attending had called it fluid redistribution pending imaging. Claire had looked at the pattern on the chart for 40 seconds when she came on shift, said nothing, and started checking his IV placement, his positioning, the angle of the bed. She'd spent the first hour of her shift making 3 small adjustments to the way he was positioned, none of which she documented as interventions because none of them technically were. She'd tilted the head of the bed 2 degrees. She'd shifted the angle of his left arm. She'd moved the IV stand 4 inches. The pressure pattern had stabilized for a while, until the kink, until 2014. Now she was working in the compressed grammar of a trauma response, calling readings, adjusting drug ratios, maintaining a running count of his rhythm that she was tracking not just from the monitor but from the pulse under her fingers, cross-referencing the two the way a navigator checks instruments against the horizon. Dr. Vance arrived at 2019 in a wrinkled scrub top, took in the room, and stopped. He looked at Claire. She was reading a rhythm strip with the monitor printout held in one hand while her other maintained pressure at a specific point on the patient's ribcage, not a standard compression position. Something else, something specific. "Hartley," Vance said slowly. "What are you holding?" "They're shrapnel," she said. "Old, encapsulated, approximately 3 centimeters from the posterior pleural wall on the left side. The imaging won't have flagged it yet because it's non-ferrous, and the capsule's been there long enough to calcify slightly. If we don't account for the root when we move him, we risk a puncture." Silence. Not the frozen kind, the processing kind, the kind where a room full of medical professionals recalibrates everything it thought it understood about the situation. "How do you know that?" Vance asked. Before she could answer, the patient moved. Not much. Enough. His right hand came off the bed rail and his fingers closed around Claire's wrist, the wrist with the silver watch. He was barely conscious. His eyes were half open, glassed with pain medication and blood loss, but they found her face with a focus that seemed to cost him everything he had. "Valkyrie," he said. The word came out ragged and thin, hauled up from somewhere deep. "You're here!" No one in the room moved. Claire's expression didn't change in any dramatic way. Something shifted slightly around her eyes. A compression, not of pain exactly, but of something being recognized that she'd spent a long time hoping she wouldn't have to recognize. Her hand turned under his grip and closed back, gently but with a firmness that said, "I've got you, same as always. I've got you. You're in a hospital," she said quietly. "You're going to be okay. Don't talk." "You know his call sign," Vance said, not quite a question. "Shepard," she said. "Petty Officer, First Class Marcus Shepard, SEAL Team 7. He has 3 prior surgeries. The last one was overseas, not documented in any stateside system. The shrapnel in the left lung cavity was from his 2nd deployment. I know where it is because I was the one who had to work around it the first time." She said this calmly. The way someone states a fact that has been true for a long time and has been waiting patiently in the background of all the other facts. In the corridor outside Bay 7, the night was doing what nights in trauma units always do, moving, churning, cycling through its own minor emergencies and paperwork and fluorescent monotony. But the small cluster of staff now pressed near the bay window had stopped all of that. There were 4 of them, then 6, watching through the glass. Because something about the scene inside had changed in a way they couldn't precisely name. It was her posture. That was the thing. She'd been moving through the last 45 minutes with the competence of a good floor nurse under pressure, recognizable, professional, admirable in the way that solid work is admirable. But now, with her hand enclosed in the patient's grip and the room reorganized around her presence, something in how she occupied the space was different. She wasn't standing in the room anymore, she was commanding it. Vance knew it immediately because he was a trauma surgeon who had worked in enough high-pressure environments to recognize the specific geometry of authority that doesn't ask for permission. He began asking her questions, not testing her, taking clinical inventory from her, and she answered each one with the efficiency of someone reading from a file they carry internally. 2 tours embedded with a SEAL team as a trauma nurse attached to a special operations medical element. She deployed under a joint military-civilian contract that placed qualified civilian nurses with SOF units when the mission tempo outpaced available corpsmen. She'd kept 4 men alive during a night exfil gone sideways in a mountain corridor, working by flashlight with half a field kit and a radio that cut out 7 minutes in. Marcus Shepard had been one of the 4. He'd been the one closest to not making it, and she'd spent 41 minutes keeping him stable with manual pressure and field modifications she'd learned in the 2nd year of that assignment. They'd given her a name after that night. His team had. The call sign spread the way call signs spread in that world, horizontally, person to person, across units, and it traveled because it had been earned in a place where names only stick if they're true. Valkyrie. The women who ride to battle and carry the worthy home. She had left that assignment 2 years ago. The contract had ended. She'd come back to civilian nursing, to floor shifts and 12-hour rotations, and the particular loneliness of a person carrying an enormous weight in a context where no one knows the weight exists. She hadn't put any of it on her resume because the unit had operated under a classification level that made formal documentation complicated, and because she'd learned in the way that people who have seen real things learn, that talking about it mostly just confused people. So she'd come back to Mercy General. She'd taken the overnight shifts, she'd done her work, and Marcus Shepard had ended up in her bay. It was 2004-7 when Chief Nursing Officer Dr. Patricia Rand arrived on the floor. She had been called not for clinical reasons, but because someone, Brenda Hollis, or one of the staff watching from the corridor, had made the kind of institutional phone call that happens when a situation has moved outside its expected shape. Rand was a thin woman in her early 60s, precise in her dress even at this hour, with the particular authority of someone who has administered systems for long enough to believe that systems are the point. She had spoken to Claire twice in her time at this hospital. Both times had been correction. The first had been about charting notation. The second had been about a patient interaction Rand had observed from a doorway and interpreted incorrectly as a nurse overstepping her clinical lane. Claire had accepted both corrections without visible emotion, which Rand had filed internally as compliance, but which was actually something else entirely. Rand entered Bay 7 at 2005-1 and took in the scene with an administrator's eye. What she saw was a floor nurse conducting clinical activities beyond her sanctioned scope, in a secured bay without a supervising physician present at the time of initiation. Vance had arrived 3 minutes in, not at the start. She saw a patient holding the nurse's hand. She saw a cluster of staff who had stopped their work to watch. She made a decision based on what she saw, which was not based on what she knew. "Nurse Hartley," she said, "step back from the patient." Claire looked at her. "I need you to step back, hand off to Dr. Vance, and come with me." "I'm not going to do that right now," Claire said. Not defiant, factual. "Excuse me? His vitals are still not stable. I'll step back when he's stable." Rand moved to the bedside, which she had the authority to do, and reached for the clip of Claire's badge, which she did not quite have the authority to do, but which she did anyway in the manner of someone who has never been told they couldn't. "You're going to step back now, or I'm going to remove you from this unit." She unclipped the badge from Claire's scrub top and held it. The room, the actual room, the medical space with its machinery and its measured urgency, held its breath. Claire's eyes went to her patient. His fingers were still loose around her wrist, but his blood pressure, on the monitor behind him, had begun a slow, tentative stabilization, still marginal, not safe. "If you move him without accounting for the shrapnel route," Claire said, "and he decompresses on the table, you will have moved him wrong. I'm the only person in this building who knows the geometry of that capsule in relation to his existing surgical history, not from a chart, from the surgery." Rand had been in hospital administration for 22 years. She had seen nurses perform heroics. She had seen nurses overestimate themselves. She had learned to apply a consistent skepticism to claims made by staff in pressured moments, because pressure makes people overstate their value, and because the system depends on calibrated skepticism at the administrative level. But she had also learned, slower than she would have liked, to read the room. And this room was not reading the way rooms read when a nurse was overstepping. This room was reading the way rooms read when the senior person in them had just been identified. She looked at Vance. He gave her nothing, kept his expression professional, which was its own answer. She looked at the monitor. She looked at the patient's hand on Claire's wrist. She looked at the badge in her own hand. She had snapped it in the process of pulling it off the clip. The lanyard attachment had broken. The badge itself was intact, but the clip housing had cracked, and the two pieces sat in her palm in a way that felt, suddenly, more symbolic than she'd intended. At 3004, two men arrived in the corridor. They were not in scrubs. They were in civilian clothes, dark jackets, the posture of people who wore uniforms so often that removing them didn't quite work, and they asked at the nurses' station for Bay 7 and someone pointed. And they identified themselves to the charge desk as liaisons from a Joint Special Operations Command element that had been tracking the patient's location since a priority alert had triggered 47 minutes ago. They came to the bay door. They looked at the room. One of them, the older one, with close-cropped gray at his temples and a set to his jaw that suggested he'd spent time somewhere the weather was very different from here, looked at Claire. His expression moved in a way that was quiet and specific and said everything. "Ma'am," he said, "we've been trying to locate you." "I've been right here," she said. And somehow, in the economy of those 4 words, the entire architecture of the room reorganized, not theatrically, not with any kind of announcement, more like a pressure equalizing. The way air moves through a corridor when a door you didn't know was closed gets opened. Rand was still standing beside the bed. She was still holding the 2 pieces of Claire's badge. She started. One of the JSOT men looked at her briefly without cruelty, and then looked back at the patient and the nurse. The look said, "This is above the current conversation." The look said, "The current conversation is finished." Marcus Shepard's eyes had closed again. His pressure had climbed to 94/61, which was still low, but was climbing in the right direction for the first time since intake. The grip on Claire's wrist had gone slack with unconsciousness, but his hand was still there, still resting, the fingers curved slightly, the way a hand stays when the last voluntary thing it did was hold on. She stood with him for another 4 minutes. Nobody asked her to step back. Nobody asked her to do anything. Then she handed off cleanly to Vance, gave him a verbal handoff that ran 7 minutes and covered every detail of the patient's history with a clinical precision that left him quiet for a few seconds before he started writing. And she walked out of Bay 7 with the specific, unhurried step of someone who has done the thing they came to do. In the corridor, Madison was standing near the charge desk. She'd been there for a while, probably. She had the look of someone who had watched something happen and was still processing what category it belonged to. Claire stopped at the desk and reached for a chart. "You doing okay?" she asked. Not about herself, to Madison. The younger nurse blinked. Yeah, are you okay? Are you okay?" "Fine," Claire said. She meant it, which was its own complicated answer. She wrote her notes for the next 30 minutes in a corner of the nurse's station. Detailed, precise, exactly as long as they needed to be, and not a word longer. When she got to the section on the patient's prior surgical history and the shrapnel location, she wrote it out fully, source noted, with the specific anatomical references she'd been carrying in her memory for 2 years. Patricia Rand found her there at 35-1. She put the broken badge on the desk in front of Claire, both pieces. She didn't say anything for a moment. "I didn't know," she finally said. "I know," Claire said. She kept writing. "I should have. It's fine." She looked up briefly, the blue-gray eyes clear, the exhaustion real and layered, the expression not cold but not warm in the performed way of someone accepting an apology because it's expected of them, just looking, just seeing. He's stable. That's what matters. Rand picked up the pieces of the badge and put them in her pocket, which was a thing she did because she didn't know what else to do with them, and which meant she carried them around for the rest of her shift and some distance into the next morning before she figured out what they meant to her. 2 days later, a formal letter arrived from a government office Claire had communicated with 3 times in 2 years. It acknowledged her role in stabilizing a named asset, the name redacted but the gratitude specific, and referenced her classification history and the ongoing relevance of her documented competence. She filed it in a folder at home. The folder had 3 other things in it: a photograph from a firebase she wasn't allowed to name, a commendation written in language she couldn't share, and a handwritten note that someone had given her the morning after the mountain corridor before the helo came. The note just said, "You held the line. We didn't forget." She held that line again at 2001-4 in a trauma bay in the middle of the night in blue scrubs and soft-soled shoes with no announcement and no audience she needed. Marcus Shepard was transferred to a specialized surgical facility at 0600. Before they moved him, he was conscious enough to be propped slightly, and someone had the sense to tell him that Claire was still on shift. He asked for her. She came to the bay. He looked at her the way people look at someone who occupies a place in their memory that the rest of their life gets oriented around. His hand came up from the blanket and she took it, the silver watch catching the light for a moment. "You came back," he said. "I never left nursing," she said. He shook his head slightly. That wasn't what he meant, and they both knew it. "You came back," he said again, and his eyes were full of something that he'd probably been carrying since a mountain corridor 2 years ago, and that now, with her hand in his and the monitors steady and the early gray of morning pressing at the windows, had somewhere to go. She didn't say anything else. She didn't have to. Some things don't need words. Some things just need someone to stay. If this story reminded you that the most important people in any room are sometimes the ones nobody thought to introduce, share it with someone who needed to hear that today. And if you've seen quiet strength like this up close, in any form, leave it in the comments. Those stories matter too.